Buenas noches, les queremos dar la bienvenida a este cuarto festival basado en Hechos Reales, que es un proyecto que nos llena de orgullo. Es un proyecto cultural colectivo y autogestivo que 4 amigas comenzamos a organizar desde el año 2017 para celebrar y promover el género de la no ficción en todos sus formatos.
Cuando empezamos a pensar este festival hace 4 años, teníamos muchas preguntas: cómo lo iba a recibir la gente, si la propuesta era necesaria, si iba a ser clara. A lo largo de los años, muchas de esas preguntas se fueron respondiendo y siempre empezamos a pensar el festival con la misma convicción, y es que para entender la realidad, una de las herramientas más poderosas que tenemos es poder narrarla. Sobre todo más en este año, que fue un año tan extraño, que es un año tan extraño, mucho más cercano a la ficción que a la no ficción. El objetivo del festival es, preguntarnos cómo nos contaron esta realidad, cómo nos la están contando, cómo la estamos recibiendo nosotros, y también plantearnos un poco qué herramientas tenemos para contarla más adelante en el futuro. El otro día un narrador, un cronista argentino, Javier Sinay, ponía en sus redes, hablando del festival, lo nombraba como nuestro festival. Y creo que ese es uno de los objetivos que tuvimos también hace 4 años, que es, que el festival sea de todos aquellos que se interesen por la crónica y por la no ficción, y que sea un poco menos nuestro, es decir, de nosotras 4. Así que, estamos muy contentas con la programación de este año, un año difícil. Hicimos el festival como nos están viendo ahora en este momento, cada una desde su casa, pero estamos muy contentas, así que también les doy la bienvenida. Muchas gracias.
Como decía Victoria, en este año tan extraño intentamos, seguir haciendo las cosas que veníamos haciendo en años pasados, como el premio Leamos de Crónica Breve, que podemos organizar gracias al Grupo Vida y Leamos ebooks, y el ganador o ganadora va a ser anunciado mañana, así que conéctense para verlo, y pueden seguirse conectando a YouTube para ver el resto de las actividades del festival. La programación está en nuestro sitio web, basado en hechosreales.com.ar. Y por último, recordarles que también, como todos los años, Basado en Hechos Reales tiene una librería amiga, con una curaduría de títulos que hacemos junto a los libreros. Este año esa librería es Bresal. Pueden entrar a su sitio web o a su Instagram para conocer esa lista de libros disponibles que están en promoción y que también tienen facilidades de envío para quienes adquieran libros durante el transcurso del festival. Y muchas gracias por acompañarnos una vez más.
Bueno, y por último, quiero agradecer, no por eso menos importante, por supuesto, a todos los sponsors y los medios que están con nosotras, que están con el festival, para hacer que esto realmente se pueda llevar a cabo. Sin ustedes sería imposible. Muchísimas gracias a Infobae, a KIS Films, a Fundación Tomás Eloy Martínez, a Fundación ICBC, a Cadal, a Leamos, al Instituto Francés, a la Embajada de Francia, al Centro Cultural de España en Buenos Aires, a Sanofi, a Impulso Cultural y Vamos Buenos Aires del Ministerio de Cultura del Gobierno de la Ciudad de Buenos Aires, a Tomás Villafañe y Titi Max, que son 2 grandes amigos y colaboradores que están detrás de escena poniendo de todo para que esto pueda llevarse a cabo. También a los medios que se suman para darnos espacios para la publicidad y también para contar este festival, como Perfil, Grupo Crónica, Clarín, Tiempo Argentino, Telam, La Agenda Revista, Redacción y Podimo. Muchas gracias de corazón a todos ustedes y los dejamos con esta gran actividad inaugural.
Bueno, me toca a mí seguir la posta y presentar esta entrevista con una invitada que estamos buscando desde la primera edición del Basado en Hechos Reales. Me refiero a Susan Orlean. Ella es una cronista muy reconocida, norteamericana, es miembro del staff del New Yorker desde 1992 más o menos. Es autora de muchísimos libros, 2 de ellos, por suerte, están traducidos al castellano y son conseguibles. Uno es El ladrón de orquídeas, muchos de ustedes habrán visto seguramente la película, y La biblioteca en llamas. Ella va a estar conversando con Titi Max, otro gran cronista, colega de ella en el New Yorker y gran amigo del festival. Titi Max participó de la primera edición del Basado en Hechos Reales. Quedamos muy amigos y estamos muy, muy contentas que sea él quien entreviste hoy, esta noche, a Susan Orlean. Así que bienvenidos una vez más a esta edición de Basado en Hechos Reales. Que disfruten muchísimo la entrevista y todo el festival. Gracias.
Gracias. Thank you, Susan, for coming.
My pleasure.
So we work together at a magazine, but despite that, we actually have only met in person maybe 2 or 3 times, I think.
And it's funny because we've known of each other for decades.
Yeah.
I mean, really a very, very long time. I left New York in 2003. And it was well before that we had sort of had our orbits cross. So now we're meeting in the middle of the internet. So
in Buenos Aires. So this is also a pleasure for me because I've always wanted to ask these questions of you, and of course, these are the kinds of questions you can only ask at a festival. So my first question for you, which is really kind of has to do with the present day, because we're living in this era of COVID, what do you see as the responsibilities of journalists in our country, and how well do you think they've done at covering this crisis?
I think it is a huge responsibility for journalists to respond and explore current conditions. And this has been epic. The idea that people are reporting on it, and to some extent at their own peril, is actually really remarkable and something that we have to appreciate. I mean, I stayed glued to my television and to my phone reading the news for the first probably 2 months of the pandemic, and was just astonished by the vigor and enterprise of the reporting. We're very, the idea that the press is the enemy of the people has never been more absurd. I mean, it's absurd always to me, but it's particularly absurd when we're in an environment like this with a crisis unfolding where people aren't free to explore and learn for themselves, and their lifeline, their information lifeline, is the press. And I think we all have to be really grateful. I'm not a person who reports on breaking news, so I'm very impressed and awed by reporters who take that difficult task in their own safety is really up for grabs. It's like being a war correspondent.
Right. In our own country. When you think about, as I think every journalist thinks about what the story might be for him or her. You're not a breaking news reporter. I'm not either. So what are you looking at? For instance, your most recent New Yorker piece was about a very strange, deadly virus in rabbits, an absolutely terrific article. Did that come out of COVID? It predated COVID? Does it speak to COVID in a way in your mind?
It was let me back up and say, I felt like a lot of writers, this urge to somehow address what's going on in the world. I mean, when there's an event this epic, it's hard to not feel some impulse to respond to it. But I tend to look for the oblique angle into the main story. And I knew that I wasn't going to be in the emergency room at, Bellevue and in fact, there was another story idea that I had proposed to the New Yorker, and it would have required me being in person in family court. And my editor said they weren't letting anybody do that kind of reporting because of concern about
they would not let us out of the house, really.
Yeah, and so I said, but I think it's a great story. And, you know, in a moment of bravery, I thought, I can do it. And then I thought, well, I don't know, maybe I can't do it. In the meantime, purely accidentally, my stepson has a pet rabbit. And completely coincidentally, he mentioned in passing that he couldn't take the rabbit to the vet because they had had an outbreak of some kind of virus that was very, very lethal. And the rabbit veterinary clinic was shut down. I think the story would have interested me regardless, but the word virus was just vibrating. And I thought, at first I thought, well, this is kind of a funny story, a kind of funny balance to this horrific human virus. Isn't that funny? There's this rabbit virus. Well, of course it wasn't funny. The more I learned about it, for one thing, it fascinated me how it traveled, which is true of viruses, whether it's in a human or an animal. So it had a lot of parallels to COVID. The blundering and how it was handled and the resistance of the US government to admit that it was here. And this is a virus that kills almost any rabbit that gets it. And you might think, well, who cares about rabbits? For one thing, there are huge numbers of pet rabbits. There are large numbers of farmed rabbits that are farmed for meat. It's not anything compared to the beef industry, obviously, but it does exist as a significant food source. And thirdly, this virus had jumped from domestic rabbits to the wild rabbit population. And the implications are huge. If you kill off all the wild rabbits, next thing you know, coyotes and wolves and hawks are going to starve to death. So the cascade of viruses' impact seemed to be, this was almost like a fable about virus. And again, this was a case of a virus that began in China, where the numbers, the number of everything in China is so huge.
But it's hard not to read it. I mean, like almost anything one reads today, it's hard not to read it with the idea that it's, you know, in a lot of ways about what's happening in our own time. You know, there's something you said earlier that really caught my ear, because one thing about your writing is that I believe I can identify a story of yours, which is not true of everybody at the New Yorker or anywhere, by give me a fairly small section. That's one of Susan's stories. So there's so you talked about an oblique angle. So, you know, when we look at all your work, you know, the book on the library and the orchids and just the whole, do you know what's a story for you instantaneously? Do you have to report 20% of it to know if that's going to work for you? Is there a single detail? Do you simply need to have a detail you love in order to get into a story? Because, I mean, there are certain writers at the New Yorker and just at large, nonfiction writers you think of as being like, they look at the headline and they say, okay, that's a big story, I'll write it. I've never felt that was how you got into a story, almost that you resisted the headline to see where could you have your piece of the joy.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a contrarian impulse, I suppose, that, you know, an idea, a mention, some bit of information will sort of fall into my lap. And I almost always know immediately if it's not for me. So I can discount lots of stuff right away. And then the things that I think might be for me, usually it's a very intuitive feeling. Something is resonating for me that's making me go, ooh, I want to know more about it. whatever this is, I want to know more. And usually it's something I don't know anything about. I knew nothing about rabbits. I mean, I don't even like rabbits particularly. So it wasn't out of some sympathy of thinking, oh my God, I love rabbits and now they're dying. It was like, oh, this is so strange. And I've never really thought about rabbits before. Now I want to think about rabbits because I wonder why this is a big deal. So
you do it partly, you do it partly to learn. I mean, I have the exact same feeling that the two of us are you know, and our colleagues are kind of in this permanent, strange kind of university where we can go and explore whatever we want, and nobody can stop us.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right. I mean, for me, usually the impulse that's the most powerful is I want to learn about this. Right. And it's, I don't report 20%, certainly. I don't, I usually go in pretty wholeheartedly if I think this sounds like it's for me. I'm usually going to go for broke, even if I if I run into obstacles, then I usually think, well, I can work around that. Right. Occasionally something just won't. The more I learn, the less I want to know, but that doesn't happen that often.
Are there stories that you've written part way or reported part way and then gone back to your editor and just said, you know, it looked fun when we were dating, but you know.
Well, yes, but I'll tell you that the funny outcome of that is that in every case, my editor has said, stick it out a little more, like do a little more, don't give up. Even when I've said, I just don't see, I don't think it's happening. It makes me wonder whether I go through this all the time. And that may be part of a cycle that I go through where I'm really enthusiastic and then I start feeling like, what was this story about? I've kind of lost the thread. And or I run into a problem where someone who I thought I could talk to won't talk to me.
Well, of course, right. There's the whole tradecraft problem of any, especially a story that revolves around an individual. But aside from the real world considerations, I'm thinking more of the sort of, you know, the platonic Susan Orlean moment where you perhaps thought to yourself, you know, where you know this is for you. I mean, well, like for instance, the Orchid Thief. What was the moment you knew you had to have? I mean, what was the moment you felt that was a story that you wanted? Was it just from the very idea of it?
From the very idea. I mean, I happened to see a little story in the Miami Herald, and I just thought, this is a great story. I'm going to do this story. And not long into reporting it as a story, I knew I wanted to write it as a book.
Right.
And it's not based
on... I was going to ask, you know, can you know immediately which one's a cat and which one's a dog? Like which one's a book and which one's an article? Or is it something you figure out after the article is published?
It's gone several ways. Like the Orchid Thief was first an article that I then felt this should be a book. Mm-hmm. Rin Tin Tin and the library book both were ideas that I knew from the beginning I wanted them to be books. I didn't see the slice that would work as a magazine piece. Mm-hmm. It just felt automatically that there needed to be so much context mm-hmm. that it wouldn't work in this shorter form. So,
you know, part of this festival is, you know, based in real facts. That's Basado and Hechos Reales. Is a kind of a call to a seriousness of purpose about nonfiction. And I think one of the questions that always comes up, especially because when I gave a workshop several years back is, well, what do you think, how much do you think a nonfiction writer can cheat? Like, you know, what, I wrote a biography of David Foster Wallace. He cheated all the time in his nonfiction. Every nonfiction writer has a personal compass. Some are, you know, high church and some are low church. Well, what's your view on this?
I'm high church. I don't believe in cheating. I don't cheat, and I'm uncomfortable hearing that someone cheats. I feel like I'd rather not know that David Foster Wallace cheated.
Right.
But for me, I feel like it's a jigsaw puzzle. These are the pieces you're given.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't like them, do another puzzle. These are the pieces that exist, and your task is to make them fit, even when the shapes are a little challenging or aren't exactly the shape you expected or wanted.
Right.
So I've never knowingly cheated. I mean, I'm sure I've written quotes down wrong.
Well, before the era of recording everything, probably we were half guessing at almost everything we wrote down. You know, there's no way you can write as fast as most people talk. I mean, that's
right.
But I get the point. You never cut a corner because you. And I mean, I agree with you. I feel that you're really either fish or fowl, and it's that the reader has a right to know which.
Exactly.
And it makes me happy to hear you, you know, to hear you say that. I mean, David Foster Wallace is a different animal. He wasn't a journalist, for one thing. So perhaps people knew. But I mean, I want to know that it happened, and I want to know that you've applied your gifts, but not altered the thing you applied your gifts to. You know, as you say, it is a little bit of a jigsaw puzzle. You recently
as a reader, I would be furious.
Have you ever written fiction? I mean, by the way.
No. It's interesting. I wrote a lot of poetry, but never fiction, which is interesting because I read fiction avidly, but I don't write it.
Yeah. It's
so hard, and which is very funny because I feel like it should seem easy, but because you can make everything up.
Right.
I don't feel like I have enough originality to make up good stuff. So to me, it seems really scary to write fiction.
And also, it's lonelier than what we do. Because I mean, we have editors, we have people who kick our butts and say, you know, get it in. I was going to ask you, I think on Twitter recently, you posted that what a pleasure it was to have an editor. I'm sure your editor is very pleased to see that. And I wondered if you would just tell our listeners a little bit about why an editor, what an editor brings to a writer's work, a good editor.
I think it's a kind of incredible privilege if you have a good editor. The idea that someone is going to give you an objective response to the piece and who presumably understands your voice as a writer enough to try to enhance what you're bringing to it rather than impose some new voice to it, to me feels, I mean, every writer should be a good editor of their own work. I feel like that's the thing that I've improved the most in the last few years. I've gotten to be a much better editor of my own work, but a good editor who can hear the flaws in the structure and the logic, it's a perspective that's very hard to have on your own. And a good editor, to me, sees what you're trying to do and helps you do it better. Rather than a bad editor, of course, is someone who doesn't even quite understand what you're trying to do. And that would be terrible. I mean, I'm lucky that I've worked with really good editors almost, I would say 90% of the time.
That is high. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Who reads your drafts first when it's ready to be looked at by another human being? Who goes first? You have writer friends, or does your spouse do it, or the pet rabbit till he passed?
My poor beleaguered husband is the first reader and the second reader and the third reader and the fourth and the fifth and the sixth and the seventh. And sometimes I feel like I give him things in such tiny increments. I can't believe he's willing to read it from the beginning again for the 11th time. But it's really a necessary part of the process for me. I feel like, he's not getting in there and doing intense structural editing as much as he's responding to just, is it working for me as a reader? So he's reading it as a reader more than as an editor. But I'm very, 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 I depend on it enormously. I feel like it gives me the confidence to keep going.
And what's the cruelest thing he's ever said to a draft of yours, or does it go from supportive to hyper supportive?
You
have to live together. That's the point. Is once you're not a writer, you're a spouse yourself. So
right. I feel like I can tell the difference between when he really loves something and when he's just saying, keep going, like it's not quite there, but he wants me just to keep going. And he's never said anything that's just flat out negative, but I can definitely tell when he's not thrilled. Probably because when he's thrilled, he's really effusive, and so I can sense it. It's just a subtle thing.
And do you then go, "What's wrong, honey?" or do you simply take the praise and go back to your, like, how much spousal intelligence and how much writerly intelligence do apply to the conversation?
Well, usually I will say to him at least 20 times. So it's okay. So you liked it. So do you like it? Did you like
the second draft? Is it better? Is it going in the right direction?
I mean, if he is kind of non-committally positive,
right?
And I just think, all right, obviously he's not crazy about it.
Right.
He's reading stuff in such an early stage that it's a very rough draft. And I will just keep coming back to him saying, so is it really okay? Is it really okay? And he's usually he'll say, well, it's early on. I can't quite tell where you're going. And it's true. I think if you show something to someone so early on, it is really hard to tell. You can't.
He even knows, because a lot of your writing revolves leaving the house. In normal times, within your relationship, it begins with the reporting, really, where you're like, I'll be away for a week, usually probably in some place you would never go. One of the great pleasures of what we do is to go places you would never go otherwise. To people. You don't generally write about super well-known people. I imagine many times it's the first time they've ever spoken to a journalist.
Yeah.
Which is both a responsibility and an opportunity. I always find. One thing that interests me about your life as opposed to your work per se is that I see you on Twitter fairly often. And I'm interested in what role is it playing for you? I think I remember a tweet where you said something about, like, maybe this is wrong, but something like, this piece is going terribly, but thank God for deadlines or something. And I thought, my God, Susan Orlean is really like showing us a bit of herself, on Twitter. So I'm curious. I would never show, you couldn't pay me to do that. So tell me, are your followers there for you and with you in a real way? I mean, or is it your friends you're writing to, essentially?
You know, I got on Twitter long ago. I think it was the first year that Twitter existed. I had just moved with my husband to a fairly isolated place in upstate New York. In the course of a day, it was very hard to have any kind of social life. And this was after having lived in New York City and Boston, people around during the day. If you want to go out and grab a cup of coffee, there was always somebody nearby. So suddenly I was in a very, very different, quite isolated place. Twitter, a friend told me about Twitter. I signed on, and it provided for me the sort of ambient sociability of an office. I would read a few things that people wrote. I would post a few things, and it would be this 2-second distraction that made me feel that I wasn't entirely alone in the world.
And you're not you're not a Facebook person as well, right?
I'm on Facebook, but I don't post there. I mean, I'm there. I used to cross post, where I would post on Twitter and it would show up.
You used to automatically, yeah.
Yeah, but I stopped doing that because I thought it was annoying to people on Facebook, and also they're very different platforms.
Right, of course.
So I'm on Facebook, but only post occasionally.
Right.
So Twitter over time it always felt like a conversation to me with people I knew, the way you would know people in an office. Mm-hmm. And obviously I don't actually know them. and there is an element of kind of lack of privacy when you're talking about struggling with a deadline or something like that, but it never fazed me. It felt always like the kind of thing you would say to someone in an office, like, the piece is a wreck and I can't figure it out, and see you later. So, and it still provides me with that. I mean, Twitter's changed a lot.
Yeah.
You know, it was a long time ago. That was probably 15 years ago. I don't remember exactly when Twitter started, but I still engage in it in that same way.
Right.
It's kind of what's on my mind at the moment. Sometimes it's personal. Sometimes it's more societal. Sometimes I'm reposting links of things I'm interested in. And sometimes I'm just blabbing.
Uh-huh.
A lot of times I'm just blabbing.
Are there so when do you get anything kind of back from you know, so I mean, there's two groups on Twitter, right? There's the professional kind of writer journalist group, and then there's the people who follow you because they love your work. Which group are you talking to, and what is the difference in kind of how they come back to you?
You know, that's an interesting question. I think it's a little hard for me to say because over the years, I've ended up having a following that's too large for me. I mean, the balance has changed.
Yeah,
it used to be that someone would reply to me and I would reply to them.
It was an old editor from Esquire who you once knew, kind of thing, and now it's
and now it's you know, about 380,000 followers. So it's something where
that's a medium-sized city.
Yeah, it's actually a fairly large city, but it means that I still see people I know on Twitter all the time, but if I get 120 responses to something, I'm not going to respond to each of them. So it has changed.
Do you learn so let's say for the rabbit virus piece, I mean, my experience of Twitter in recent years is it tends to be the place where one is sort of kicked around a bit by people who seem to have an immensity of time. I don't remember it being that way earlier. Earlier, I remember being quite supportive. And I'm curious whether you ever get that from your Twitter, or if your Twitter remains, you know, essentially a world of people who really want Susan Orlean to succeed, you know, to write another great piece. You know what I mean? Or because, I mean, one thing to interrupt, but like one of the things you do, which I admire, you know, and to some extent I do it too, is you don't repeat yourself. Like there's, you know, your orchid book has nothing to do in common with the library book except the sensibility, you know. I mean, so you're courageous and you're willing to go into areas, I think this is in a way a hallmark of your work, where you've never been before. And your writing show, one of the beauties of your writing, I think, is that it takes us with you as a friend.
Well, thank you. I mean, that is certainly what I strive for. And it is true that I'll write about something and get lots of, say, orchid people who start following me and maybe expect that I'm going to revisit the subject, and I'm not going to. And maybe they then at some point decide this isn't for me. She's not an orchid writer.
Yeah.
By and large, I have been spared some of the
more brutal.
Yeah, I mean, I don't get into fights on Twitter. I don't pick them, and I don't. If somebody says something nasty, I don't engage. I feel like you can't win. So just ignore it. And as a result, or maybe coincidentally, I don't end up having lots of people who try to pick a fight with me, because I just won't respond. And I will say that's not because that isn't my actual personality. My actual personality is really reactive. But I've seen too much go on in social media where you just think you shouldn't have responded. You just, this is not an actual conversation. And to think you're going to make your point and come, you know, so generally speaking, I think I've fostered a more positive kind of environment, and I don't look to stir people up or get arguments going. And I mean, I'm not going to shy away from something political, but I don't want to get into a fight with anybody. I don't see the possible value of that.
And how much time would you say you give Twitter on a daily basis? Minimal, or I mean, do you spend some time reading tweets? I
usually feel strange if I haven't tweeted in the course of a day. Although I usually don't tweet.
Time for a tweet.
Usually on weekends, I tweet very little.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost like it's my day off. But, and I do read a lot of what's on there, though I follow many fewer people than follow me, because I would be overwhelmed by, I mean, there's just so much stuff out there. How much time in a day? Boy, I'm not sure. It would be hard to quantify it because it's in tiny sort of fragments of time.
On your phone or on your computer?
Well, usually on my phone, although now that I'm much more used to seeing it on my phone, but when I'm working at my desk and I'm on my computer and I'm bored or stuck, I always think, oh, well, there's always Twitter to check in on.
That's when I go for the ice cream.
Yeah.
Do you not protect yourself from the internet when you're actually working on a piece? You don't unplug everything and put up.
Well, when I was working
on door, you know.
Yeah, when I was working on the library book, I downloaded that Freedom.
Yeah, I have that.
You know, locks you out of the internet, but I cheated so much that I felt like I was embarrassed that I was cheating, but what I did was I locked myself out of the internet on my computer, but I could see it on my phone, but it was a lot less attractive on my phone.
Right.
The equivalent of that is going to a place like Yaddo or McDowell, although Yaddo now has internet. But to me, it was one of the great attractions to going to a retreat was not having easy access to the internet.
So the way you would work then is gather what you needed beforehand, take it with you, download it, or
yeah, because it was not a good place to do reporting. You know, so I went there when I was writing, and you could do a minimal amount of reporting if you needed to fill in a particular fact. But
on the top of the hill, you could get a signal.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Oh, there was definitely a lot of, holding your phone in the driveway and trying to catch the signal.
Always is. A lot of the people who attended the festival the year I was there, and I think this is consistent, are themselves young writers. And I'd be interested, obviously you began in the United States, they're beginning in Argentina. There are big differences, but what for you is like the thing that you look for first in a story? Like, you're reading the newspaper, or you're listening to your family talk about their rabbits. Clearly your antenna are up. But like if you were, giving advice, allowing for the fact that you and I are not the age of many of the people who are just now starting, but I don't know that it changes that much. Like what do you suggest? Like how, because you've got to start somewhere, right? You got to pick something to write about.
Well, I think figuring out what to write about is one of the most important and kind of overlooked parts of the practice of being a writer. You can work somewhere where they just give you assignments, but I think if you have the desire to really develop your own voice as a writer, it begins most fundamentally with figuring out what you want to write about. And we spend no time thinking about how to do that or cultivating the practice of doing it, which is funny. I mean, you kind of have to back up and think, well, but that's the basis of everything, is figuring out what to write about. And I do remember when I first started my career right out of college, and I was absolutely paralyzed by the idea of coming up with this story. I didn't know what a story was. I didn't know how to recognize the story. I had no idea how to separate ordinary curiosity from what would make an actual narrative. And no editor ever sat down and said, let's talk about this or think about what are ways to do it. So it was definitely a hard-won bit of, knowledge and experience, where I took what in a way was the easy route, which was to simply follow my curiosity. If something made me curious, I felt like there could be a story in it, rather than looking for stories, looking for a narrative that already existed. So if there was a subject that I wanted to learn more about, I would look at it and try to figure out how could I enter this universe. That, this isn't for everybody. And certainly there are times when I think I wish I first looked for the narrative, because it can be really tough to write a story from I'm curious, now where's the narrative? But wouldn't it be great if it were the other way around, where you knew already the shape of the story? But it's just not the way my mind works. works. I find myself
Right.
first curious, and then I think, all right, what could be the narrative?
And you never, I mean, you were never, the more obvious alternative is become a newspaper reporter. You were never a newspaper reporter. You never worked have you ever worked in a newsroom?
I wrote a lot for the Boston Globe Sunday magazine, which, doesn't quite count. And I wrote a few pieces for the body of the paper, but I never worked in a newsroom in any kind of regular way. And I sometimes wish that I had, not because I think I would have enjoyed the writing, but I think I would have enjoyed the environment.
And you never took an office at the New Yorker?
Yeah, I did. Oh, I had an office at the New Yorker for a long time, actually, probably 10 years. But I gave it up when I moved.
Right.
And I did, though it's not like a newsroom.
No.
Where people are talking
like really.
And but it was a reasonable equivalent, and I really gave up my office at the magazine with great pain and anguish. But I was living in Boston, and after a few years, they let me keep it for a few years, and then they finally said, "Look, you don't live here. This doesn't make sense." So
they noticed. A last question, and thank you for taking all this time with us. So you're now, I won't ask what you're working on, but are you now allowed to go out of the house? You're back in the field, or you continue to report entirely from your house in LA?
I'm really just reporting from my house. It's
strange.
I think it's still early to go back to, I have a piece that's half reported for the New Yorker that I really need to do it in person. And I just have to wait. I was very lucky with the rabbit story because it was something that really was manageable to do just from my desk.
Yeah.
It was mostly conversations, phone calls, research. It would have been different if I could have gone out and met with people, but the story, I don't think the story suffered enormously from me not going out into the field.
Right. No, I agree.
Right now, everything I'm working on is from home.
Yeah, it's strange how much one can achieve, and also what one can't, achieve. I'm not a huge Zoom fan. I cannot report through Zoom the way I can report when I'm there with a person. The interactions just aren't the same. You can fake it only so far. You don't really have to be with a person. I just have to enough time.
And also, part of the way that I report is often I report all around the person. And one of the odd things about Zoom is that you are confined to this box around the person. Often for me, the best details are the thing they left on the dashboard of their car, or that, as it's the stuff that you can't anticipate, that's not sitting in a controlled, completely circumscribed window on. I often feel like I get more from being around a person than from talking to them.
Absolutely.
So that's what we can't do right now.
The talking is what you have to go through in order to find something out about them afterwards.
Right. Yeah.
Sniff. Well, Susan, I hope if one day that you can join me in Buenos Aires. It's an extraordinary festival with terrific participants.
I'd love to. I would really love to. I was there once for a couple of days and was completely just visiting friends, and was really fascinated, and I loved it.
Yeah.
And then I just finished watching this incredibly intense documentary about Albert Niesman and the investigation into the bombing of the Jewish Center. And it intrigued me even more because it's
Who made the documentary?
God, I don't know. I'll send you the link. I got obsessed with it.
Yeah. I'm not gonna.
It's amazing.
So thank you. I hope that that everybody enjoyed this as much as I did. And I imagine at some point you and I will be on the same side of the continent. But if not, we'll do another one down the road. But thank you again.
Thanks for great questions. It was a real pleasure.
All right. Bye, Susan.
Bye-bye.